Erev Tov. Good evening. This summer, as many of you know, I was on a summer sabbatical, and my family was supposed to go to Israel, but we know that Israel was not the easiest place to spend 2.5 months. It was too tense, too unpredictable. So my family ended up going to Europe instead, to France, where I partly grew up, and where my parents still have a village house. And from there, we traveled around. Europe is good for that. And so we ended up in the car a lot of the time. And I have children who are 8 and 6 years old. And so we would listen to an audio book. And there was one specific audio book, was an educational book that we listened to almost the entire time. It was called The Story of the World. And it's a history over dozens and dozens of hours, from ancient times to modern times, and all very fascinating. By the end of the summer, we were 14 hours plus, and we'd only reached medieval times. It was a good place to do it. And every culture and every society and civilization that they explored over those hours, they would tell their history, all the facts, the ancient Greeks and the Babylonians and those who lived in the Indus Valley, and forward on and on to Saxons and the Vikings, the Incas, also the Israelites, told our stories. And then they also not only told the historical facts, but they also, for each civilization, gave us a sense of who they were by the stories they told about themselves. And so Homer and the Odyssey and Beowulf and all kinds of other stories that I never heard of. But stories of origin, stories of bravery, story of heroism. And the moment we got in the car, the children would always immediately ask us, put on the story of the world. We hope it wasn't a cataclysm and death episodes. But more than once, what was most moving were those stories that they told themselves about who they were. And then at the end, the narrator would often say, and this story has been told from then until this very day. So whenever I heard these stories, it made me think of our stories. Stories I've heard my whole life, and that inform so much of our Jewish calendar and our consciousness. And also, there was a certain time in my own life where I decided to spend a year studying Judaism part-time in Jerusalem. And I was in a class with this wonderful Rabbi, Rav Meir Schweiger of Pardes. And he was just taking us through the Torah. We'd read commentaries and all kinds of other supplements to just the Torah. And I remember one day, and I'm in the book of Genesis, and suddenly I had this moment. We were reading about Sarah, and I don't even remember exactly what we were reading about, but somehow I just connected completely different with this story about Sarah. And I couldn't relate to some elements of the story, the camels and the tents and the servants, all that. But suddenly I just saw her story that was about her growth as a human being in her own circumstances and what she was going through in her spiritual life, and the decisions that she was having to make regarding her family, and just going through everything she went through about trying to mold her life to be a better person, a good person, high aspirations and inspiration. And then just at that point in my life, I suddenly connected and realized that these stories were alive for me suddenly in a new way. And it was in talking to me from where I was at that moment. And it was exciting, and it strengthened my resonance with our own people and Judaism. And I started to see myself that I was part of that story, because I suddenly was hearing and understanding from the inside what was happening. And then there was a clear path from then to the Torah becoming alive again, the Talmud becoming alive, and then what brought me to eventually being a rabbi. I think it really brought me back to where I came from. That was a sense. It was uncovering, seeing with clarity and understanding my own self through the values of our people. I remember studying and relating to some of the decisions that they had to make. Sarah and her husband, all these characters, in some ways so different, but they were trying to emulate what it means to be a good person, to follow God, and what to do with their life in Canaan, and who were they, and what was happening inside of them, to relate it to their children. And at that moment, I had this feeling that their family was my family. And what they started all those years ago, 3,500 years ago, as the first Jews, and the father and mother of the Abrahamic faiths, we still have a choice to follow in that way or not. And it's not a matter of every deed, because our religious lives look nothing like theirs did, or how we walk in the practical details, but how we walk in the world, to live a life in those stories, a life of intentionality and of trying to understand what's happening to us within the broader context, and the way God kept testing them and keeps testing us, the spirit of those stories. And this is how we Jews return to ourselves, through those stories, by finding new inspiration and learning our steps through all the challenges and joys of life. And maybe this is in fact a tshuva that we're called to do every year at this time, during the high holidays, and maybe especially this year of unprecedented turmoil and challenge. We're asking, well, how do we approach the holidays? And what is it that will make a difference for each of us? And the practice tshuva, meaning repentance, literally return, as we say every year. And that's the central practice of everything, this whole time period. It began almost a month ago at the beginning of Elul, but in earnest beginning tonight through Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and then into Sukkot, and to the end of Sukkot, Hoshana Rabbah, a return. What's a return? It's return to the place within us where we feel connected to where we come from, and the place that gives us a sense of strength and a sense of life, to meet the adversity and to find resilience. 3 weeks ago, the whole Jewish world, and especially here in America, we were mourning with the parents of Hirsch Poland Goldberg, one of the hostages who was killed at the beginning of September. So in the aftermath of that happened, there was an Israeli-American rabbi who lived in the same neighborhood where Rachel Poland Goldberg lives, and her husband, Jonathan. And he was being interviewed by Israeli TV. And they looked at his kippah, and in Israel they judge people, their religiosity, by what their kippah looks like. And so they looked at his kippah and they wondered, and they didn't know. So they asked him, well, what kind of Jew are you? So he thought for a bit and he said, well, I'm a Rachel Poland Goldberg and Jonathan kind of Jew. And Israeli TV understood, because of how immersed all of Israeli society was in their story, as we all have been. And they understood what their Judaism was, a Judaism that she evoked through powerful speeches and advocacy around the world, from going to see the Pope to the conventions here in America. And wherever she was, whether it was before the tragic end or afterwards, she always brought in this compassionate, beautiful Judaism, where she talked about the main values of our tradition. And even at her funeral, she spoke of her hakarat hatov, her gratitude that the divine had given Hirsch to her to be with for those years that she was able to be his mom. He was meant to be in the world, and now he was finally free. And she quoted prophets and Jewish texts. It wasn't even about the quotes, but it was the strength she showed, the Jewish resilience. I think it reminded all of us at a very difficult time a little bit about who we are and the kind of Judaism, the values that we aspire to, of compassion. And there were members of this ancient, resilient people who try and find strength even amidst loss and sadness. There our values are. as that rabbi said, a generous Judaism. And then Hirsch and the others, Carmel, Eden, Alexander, Almog, Ori, in that moment they became part of our story. Just as all the heroes of October 7th and those who perished. And this is what we do in the face of adversity. And with everything going on, most of what each one of us can do, face of events that are far beyond our control, is do our best to go back to who we are, to our path, to our ways of being, to our God, and to immerse ourselves in these stories and teachings and try and find a pathway forward. And Hirsch's story reminded us that this terrible event too eventually becomes part of the story that those afterwards will talk about. So we have a saying from our earliest rabbinic sages, Ma'aseh avot siman lebanim, that the deeds of the fathers and mothers are a sign to the children. Kind of like you look at those who came before and you try and find signs for the future. And on one hand, it's about the strangeness of life, that somehow we keep going through the same exact thing over and over, and that the same tropes keep coming back throughout history to confront us and for us to live through. Similar stories as our great-grandparents and going all the way back to the beginnings of our people. But it's also telling us that there is a roadmap for how to live and how to face it and how to find strength through all of it. And I think in the end that in the last year, many of us have felt even more firmly Jewish or part of this story than we've ever felt before. And that we've returned to a place in ourselves forced by hardship and all the difficult circumstance that is deeper and more alive, more Jewish. I said to somebody recently, a young person, the Jewish part is now in Technicolor. There's no way to avoid it. It's bright in front of you. And part of that is connecting to all these old stories that are in our books, and we try and revisit and find meaning in them, the patriarchs and matriarchs, our tradition, and feeling the aliveness of that story and what it means for us through 3,500 years, our mission to be a light unto the nations, a kingdom of priests, hearing truths for our lives as we hear those age-old stories of resilience. They inspire us strength for sure, a path. And it's not only those ancient stories, also all the other stories since then of our people that define, that we've been hearing through our lives. Those historical stories of flourishing communities who then had to face expulsion and exile, suddenly lost their homes, but then somehow we started a new life and continued forward and brought new teachings and new understanding and kept going to cultures from where they came from. And we kept returning to who they were and their core. Stories of the Holocaust for us in our generations that we cherish and keep sharing. And the stories of our own personal families, our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents who facing adversity and struggle came to this country amidst revolutions, often in dire poverty, and they too kept returning and finding a new beginning and sense of self-worth in their heritage. And so we have all these stories, kind of like in the books, Story of Our World. We have our Jewish stories. Those are stories that make us feel right within ourselves. Make sure we do the right thing and so we don't mess it all up. Because they keep telling us how to be, and they connect us to that part of ourself that's part of something greater. They connect us to our soul, the soul of Israel, our ancestors, our origins, to why we were created. Last year, I had a meeting with a young family from our synagogue and a meal, and we were talking about this impossible year that we're all going through since October 7th and everything that's happened. And at a certain point, she said to me, I kind of feel like my Rabbi since this all started. I kind of feel like my grandmother. And I could see that she was completely changed by what had happened because she'd found a sense of her Jewish identity was something that now was just firmly fixed on her. She couldn't get away from it, for good or for worse. And that made her part of our story, as all of us have become even more a part of our story. So this evening, Selichot is a night of connecting to our soul, beginning to find that path back to who we are, to our purpose, to our God, a path to all those stories of our people. And for us Jews, those stories are the land of our soul. That's the land of our soul, where the land of everything takes place, from Jerusalem to Babylon to Russia to the United States to Golden Medina. All those men and women who made the stories happen. And that's a path for us to walk in, that we can always walk in, even in such difficult times. And we study the stories, we become absorbed in the stories, and then we become the very stories of our people. So what is tshuva? Tshuva is returning to who we really are. It's returning to those stories, whichever one it is that grips each one of us. And for each one of us, it's a little bit different. But a place in us, within us, where we suddenly feel alive and full of meaning, part of something greater. And we hear those echoes of steps of time immemorial, that journey that we've been through with the divine from the days of Abraham and Sarah until this very day. Erev Tov.